All right, 3rd century. Last week I was noting with you that the church was battling on 3 fronts. They had, of course, the political threat, persecutions, and then they had theological threats coming both, as I characterized it, from the left and from the right. By the time we get to the 3rd century, the political threat has died down. So beginning by the year 200 or shortly thereafter, and for the bulk of the 3rd century, Christian people are more or less free from persecution. I don't want to overstate that, because it still was going on to some degree, but not nearly as severely as it had in the 2nd century. The only exception to that comes toward the end of the 3rd century with the most ferocious persecution of all that took place under Diocletian, and we'll take a look at him in just a moment. The challenges to Christian teaching, however, did continue unabated, and if anything, became even more severe at this time. And again, it was an assault from 2 different angles. One, more or less emanating from the city of Antioch, and the other from the city of Alexandria. So we have 2 cities that more or less stand for 2 quite different approaches to Christian understanding. Antioch is north of Jerusalem. So we were mentioning a few weeks ago, Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. Christian people who were Jewish fled the city, escaped the bloodbath that took place in Jerusalem. Gradually over time, as the dust settled, they wound up north in Antioch. And Antioch is about 200 miles north of Jerusalem, and it became a kind of neo-Jerusalem, a place where a highly Jewish approach to the Christian faith and a highly Jewish population of Christian people resided. At the same time, you have a city down in North Africa called Alexandria, which I'm calling Neo-Athens. So my arrows come down from Athens and up from Jerusalem, and you kind of get the picture there. By this time in history, Athens was no longer a great intellectual capital. It was more of a great museum. Most of the real work that was being done in the Hellenistic world was being done in Alexandria. So it had become kind of a center of academics, and even Christian intellectual pursuits were carried on to a significant degree in Alexandria. The problem is Antioch was representing a very Jewish approach to the Christian faith. Alexandria was representing a very Gentile or Hellenistic or Greek approach to the Christian faith, and obviously those 2 didn't see eye to eye. And so there is in the 3rd century a kind of developing Cold War in the Christian world between these 2 very diverse approaches to how we understand Christian teaching. The main character who dominated Antiochian Christianity was a fellow whose name was Paul of Samosata. Samosata is a little town about 20 miles outside of Antioch. So he grew up, as it were, in a suburb of Antioch. He eventually became the bishop, that is the chief leader of the Christian church in Antioch. I want to emphasize that, because when we reflect here briefly on what he taught, you'll wonder, how he got to that position. But it is a comment on the form of Christianity that was really flowing out of this, as I say, very Jewish approach to the Christian faith. What did he stand for? He rejected outright the doctrine of Trinity. This is the leader of the Christian church in a major Christian center in the 3rd century, repudiates the idea of Trinity. He repudiated the term logos as applied to Christ. We mentioned last week that John's gospel begins, of course, famously, in the beginning was the Word, the Greek word logos. And that became one of the most important descriptive approaches to Christ, was especially interesting to the Greek person, because logos had a rich tradition in Greek thought going way, way back. And now for Christian thinkers to come along and say, this that the Greeks have been groping for all through the centuries, this is it. This is what you've been looking for, Christ, you see. Was something they could follow that, they could appreciate it, but the Jewish world found that objectionable and rejected Logos Christology. More than that, they rejected the first 14 verses of John's Gospel. Paul of Samosata said that is not part of John's Gospel. It was added later. That's how severe was his commitment. He adopted, or I should say he affirmed, what's called adoptionism. Adoptionism is a view that says Christ was adopted as the Son of God at his baptism. He was a man specially given grace by God, but he was only a man. But at his baptism, he was given some great gift, some great anointing, and as a result of that, he began to dynamically change, and he was elevated, but it was always, in a sense, as a man, so that now we can, in a sense, adore Christ, appreciate him, recognize him, revere him. But Paul of Samosata said we should not worship him in the same way we worship God. So here's a major Christian leader taking a position like that in the 3rd century. He said that the unity of the Son and the Father that we hear of in the New Testament is a moral unity, not a substantive unity. That is, they are one in purpose, but not one in being, you see. If you looked around today for a religion that basically represents the views of Paul of Samosata, it would be the Jehovah's Witnesses. So it'd be like saying one of the major Christian leaders in the 3rd century was basically a Jehovah's Witness, all right, in his theology. That would be a pretty accurate description of him. The main student of Paul of Samosata that we'll consider next week is a fellow named Arius. And you may know the Arian controversy is what precipitated the Nicene Council, which was convened by Constantine, but we'll save a further description of Arius for a later time. On the other hand, in Alexandria, you have an alternative approach to the Christian faith, which probably is as far out in the other distant weeds as is Paul of Samosata, you know. So this is kind of a real broad sort of spectrum of views here that all fell broadly within what was accepted Christian teaching. Sabellius said that Christ was an emanation of God. This is the magic word, emanation. The sun radiates light. Sabellius said God emanates being. Okay, something like that. As the light shines from the sun, being emanates from God. Now, if you follow that through, it means that in a sense, everything that is represents a kind of emanation of God. And there is that which is closer to God and that which is more distant from God. But in a sense, God is ultimately in everything. So it is a kind of pantheism, you see. The Jewish approach had a hard monotheism. God is one, only one, no Trinity, absolute monotheistic affirmation. On the other hand, from the Greek point of view, God, there's a very kind of thin line or gray area that separates God from his creation. And God is just sort of spilling out the created order as if it were something of his own stuff. And Sabellius gives us an idea like that. However, he uses an interesting term to describe this. He says that Christ is homoousia with God. Now, homoousia is a word, a phrase that means same stuff. And what's interesting is that the first major creed of the church used that same language. So the Council of Nicaea affirms that Christ is homoousia, same stuff with God, but rejects Sabellianism. This is where heretics help us out. You know, never be too hard on a heretic. Because sometimes they, just by putting up the fight, force Christians to get more clarity. And it's interesting how many times heretics have given us language we found useful. So we don't accept the heresy associated with the term, but we like the term. And so that's what Sabellius did. He gave us this term, homoousia, and the church actually picked that up. Sabellius also gave us these terms, God of God, light of light, true God of true God. You ever heard that kind of language? Straight from Sabellius. One of the great heretics of church history gives us language we have loved ever since. So just one of those interesting ironies. Sabellius, in any event, used that kind of language, but he used it in the sense of emanation. That's what the church finally would not accept. He said that Christ only appeared to be human. This was called docetism, from the Greek word dokeo, which means to seem or to appear. Christ only appeared to be human, like a carefully contrived phantom. He looked human, but wasn't. So do you see the kind of symmetry? Antioch is affirming the humanity of Christ but denying his deity. Alexandria is affirming the deity of Christ but denying his humanity. And Christian believers are sort of caught in the middle here, trying to figure out just how do we understand the character of Christ in connection with our understanding of God. And this is an ongoing conversation, controversy continuing during this time. The major theologians of the 3rd century, I'm not going to take much time on them just to mention their names. One was a fellow named Clement of Alexandria, and the other was a guy named Origen. They are interesting. I almost thought I'd take a little time to tell their stories. Origen especially is a very interesting character. Again, by modern standards, we would say they're a little bit off in their understanding of Christian truth, but then, hey, we've had, another 1,700 years to think about it, that they didn't have at their disposal. Both of them, however, are trying to defend the Christian faith against this mounting kind of pressure that's coming from either side. So just so you'll at least recognize their names. The last gasp of persecution takes place in the latter part of the 3rd century under a Roman Caesar whose name is Diocletian. This is one of the most famous and maybe the most severe of all of the persecutions that occurred. It was empire-wide. It cut through every part, every stratum of the Roman world. Diocletian himself was interrupting what had been a very long period now. The better part of this entire century had been rather quiet, and Christian people had been able to, with a certain degree of confidence, move and live and have their being in the Roman world without necessarily fearing that the ceiling was going to cave in on them at any moment. All of this ended under the reign of Diocletian. Diocletian himself was one of the most competent, indeed brilliant, Roman rulers to come along in years. This is another irony of church history. At least in the Roman world, it was the best emperors who were the hardest on Christians. It was the licentious, self-absorbed, narcissistic, immoral emperors who didn't really give a rip. And so Christians got along fine when the emperor was worthless. But every time you get a guy who really cares about the Roman world, all of a sudden Christians are in the crosshairs of his concern. And Diocletian is the last of these great, pagan, brilliant Roman rulers, and he recognized that the Christian faith was a profound threat to everything that he understood Rome to stand for. And so he launches a somewhat risky proposition from his point of view, this persecution against Christian people. He came out of a military background. He was a very good bureaucrat, very smart guy organizationally. He divided the Roman world up into 4 quadrants. So east and west were already somewhat divided, and then he divided each of those into 2 more. So we have 4 altogether: north, west, south, west, and so on. And he was over all of it and was a very competent kind of chairman of the board, you might say. But toward the very beginning of the 4th century, he does launch this persecution. It had been growing for a time, and it lasted about the last 3 years of his reign, so 303 to 305. Horrific persecutions. Many people were killed. Many were dismembered. There were Christians that had their eyes gouged out and other kinds of, horrific sorts of torture and persecution, all in the name of their Christian faith. And so that's the kind of thing that he was doing. Obviously, it was not completely successful. Christian people still weathered the storm and came out the other end. Diocletian died in the year 305. He died somewhat unexpectedly, and therefore he hadn't really set up a good, solid arrangement for succession. And so there was a kind of collapse of order in the Roman world for a time, and especially in the West, civil war broke out for a year or two, in which both sides, the North and the South, were vying for control, and that is somewhat important to our story. Rome's first Christian emperor, of course, as you know, is Constantine. Constantine was the son of Constantius, and Constantius was the ruler of the West under Diocletian to the north. So Constantine comes from the man who was in fact one of these four tetrarchs in the Roman world. He was himself, that is Constantine, was served under Diocletian in his military. So when Constantine was a young man, he was involved in military expeditions here and there, so he had a strong military background himself and had the experience of a soldier and so on. He had had a command and that sort of thing. When Diocletian died in 305, Constantine returned home. It's always been a little bit of a question, and I don't think it's ever been definitively answered, whether or not Constantine was himself involved in any of the persecution of Christians. The weight of evidence seems to be against it. It seems that he was more involved in military expeditions here and there and was not immediately involved in persecuting Christians. However, at this point, it's certainly possible that he might have been. This is certainly before any claim to be a Christian convert. He was sympathetic to Christians, but he was also a loyal son of the Roman world, and so it's possible. And if it was the case that Constantine had been persecuting Christians, that it makes him kind of an Apostle Paul sort of guy, once a persecutor of the church and then a great defender of it. I'm not so sure that's the way it actually happened, but it's been a somewhat open question down through the years. When Diocletian died, Constantine returned home, and as it turns out, his own father, Constantius, died the following year. And so Constantine, in the year 306, actually assumes position of ruling the north part of the Roman world in the west. There had been some civil war going on. That died down for a time, so basically he was able to manage affairs in his own domains without a lot of hostility going on between himself and those who were ruling in southern Europe, mainly in Italy. The domains that he controlled were at this point Britannia, which would be England up to the wall of Hadrian there, which of course separates it from Scotland, Gaul, which would be modern-day France, and Iberia, which would be Spain. So that was basically what he was controlling. His domain did not go east as far as Italy, and so this is in 306 Constantine's holdings. He was generally tolerant of the Christian movement, and that seems to have been a combination of his father's philosophy and also the fact that his mother was a conspicuous Christian. You may know the mother of Constantine, Helena, was famous in her own right. She was eventually sainted by the Catholic Church, but all the way through she seems to have been a heartfelt Christian, and that obviously had a little bit of influence on the family life of Constantine, So whatever his own personal views were at that stage, he nevertheless, out of deference to his mother, appreciated her Christian conviction. Eusebius, the church historian, quotes Constantine as saying this in this time frame, that is this kind of early moment in his career. He said, quote, "My father revered the Christian God and uniformly prospered, while the emperors who worshiped the heathen gods died a miserable death. Therefore, that I may enjoy a happy life and reign, I will imitate the example of my father and join myself to the cause of the Christians, who are growing daily while the heathen are diminishing." Interesting quote, isn't it? You see, so you don't know if that's heartfelt faith or just political pragmatism. It may be a little of both. I tend to favor the latter. I think at this point, Constantine wasn't quite there yet. Some people think he never did get there. Some people think he never was, just anything more than a practical political Christian. I'm not quite that cynical about him. But at this point, I think he was simply observing the effect of various perspectives and noticing, especially with his own father's experience and others that he was aware of, that things tended to go better if you walked in the way of the Christian movement. So that seems to be as far as it went. He may have been impressed with the death of Diocletian, who had been such a severe persecutor of Christians and died a horrible death. And in many ways, I think Constantine might have taken some notes at that point, that didn't turn out so well for him. In any event, the great turning point for Constantine certainly is this incident that we call the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. The Milvian Bridge, as you probably know, is a major bridge that gave access to the city of Rome as you're coming down kind of Italian peninsula there. What happened was that there was a usurper who took over control of the other part of the Western Empire. His name was Maxentius. So the fellow that had served under Diocletian is set aside, pushed aside, and Maxentius asserts himself in as takes over. And he really changes the policies. At this point in Italy, there had been a fairly tolerant kind of attitude toward religious practice, and Maxentius changes that. He comes back in wanting to really push more of a principled paganism, and he once again launches a fairly severe assault on Christian people who numbered, there was a sizable number of them in Italy, and so he usurped power in Italy and Africa. And the people who were living there, knowing that Constantine was much more favorably disposed toward Christian people, appealed to him. Send him a couple of emails, come and help us. And so this appeal from these folks was probably all Constantine needed. I mean, after all, he was a Roman military character. It wasn't like he needed a whole lot of encouragement to go to war, And so when he gets an appeal from the indigenous population that they should come, and especially when they mix into the appeal, come and rescue us who are Christians, who are being, abused by this character Maxentius, that's probably all Constantine needed. And so he musters an army just short of 100,000 and heads for Italy, crossing the Alps. He doesn't pull a Hannibal and cross it in the dead of winter with 37 elephants. He doesn't do that. He waits till the weather's a little better and crosses in times when the more favorable kind of conditions there. But he does come with a very substantial military force. And so he comes basically from Gaul, comes across the Alps, marching down into Italy in response to this appeal. As he's approaching, he's aware that Maxentius also has a very respectable military force. And as the story goes, and again, people will dispute how much of this is legend, how much of it is fact. I'm just telling you the story as it's been reported, largely from Eusebius, who knew him personally. The man who's sometimes called the father of church history was a contemporary of these events, and so I'm relying rather heavily on his account of it. But as the story goes, Constantine, the night before what was going to be a major battle that was going to take place at the Milvian Bridge, is praying and concerned about this, and in this moment he sees a vision. And the vision, of course, is a vision that either he saw in a dream or a waking vision, not clear which. And it's not altogether clear exactly what the vision looked like or what form it took, but certainly you have this very, very famous incident from the career of Constantine in the year 312, in which he reportedly saw this vision. And of course the message was that he should use the image in the vision as a symbol, and in this sign conquer. You're probably familiar with that. It's probably the most famous single incident that comes from the career of Constantine. The debate continues to this day, as you can well imagine. Just what did he see? Some people say this was pious fraud, that Constantine just made this up because he was trying to find something to spark his guys, give them a new kind of sense of enthusiasm to go into this battle and fight with all their hearts. Some people, on the other hand, think that Constantine actually had a true and genuine vision. Certainly his report of this for the rest of his life was consistently always affirming something was actually before his eyes there. He never implied in any sense that this was some sort of fiction or fabrication on his part. And so for whatever it's worth, we just have to leave that. I'll leave it to your own judgment as to how much credibility you want to attach to it. But that is the story. The image of the vision is famously this chi rho symbol. If you know Greek, you know that the two Greek letters there, the chi, which is kind of the X letter, and then the letter that looks like a P is actually the Greek letter rho, and it makes the R sound in the Greek language. It's the Greek word Christos, which starts chi rho, iota, sigma, tau, omicron, sigma, Christos, And of course the first two letters of the word Christ, chi rho, have become then traditionally a symbol for Christ and for the Christian movement. And that was presumably, at least that was what Constantine reported seeing in this vision. And so he emblazoned that on the military hardware that was going to be used by his soldiers as they headed into battle. And the Cairo symbol has continued to be to this day an important symbol of Christ and of the Christian movement. The Milvian bridge looks something like this. This is not the one that was standing at the time, because what Maxentius did was destroy that one. And his strategy was this. He wanted to fight Constantine on the other side of the river. So he's going to cross out of Rome, across the bridge, fight Constantine. He destroyed the Milvian bridge, and he put up in its place a kind of a makeshift pontoon bridge. And his strategy was, if he beats Constantine, then all is fine. If he's losing, then he's got an escape route. And he can run back across the bridge and immediately destroy it before Constantine can follow across the bridge. So that's Maxentius' plan. All right. So that bridge was not there. It was a pontoon bridge. He crosses over. He is definitely being bested by Constantine. Constantine was a brilliant military strategist and tended to win anytime he was fighting in the open battlefield. And so Maxentius is getting the worst of it and finally calls a retreat. And on the signal, all these guys run back to the bridge, and they're crossing in such a panic that the bridge collapses. And the pontoon bridge falls apart. It was supposed to be destroyed once they crossed, but as it turns out, it destroyed itself a little too quickly. Maxentius, wearing all his military hardware, sunk like a rock, drowned, and most of his soldiers. It almost brought back images of the Exodus and the chariots of Pharaoh in the Red Sea kind of scene, and in fact that parallel has been drawn more than once. So Constantine comes running up to the river, and all he sees are sort of glub, glub, glub coming up to the surface of the river, and what used to be the army of Maxentius is now largely died at the bottom of this sea. So anyway, it was kind of a miraculous victory. Certainly Constantine was on the winning side of it, but it had such a dramatic and final conclusive end that he himself took this, at least by his own testimony, as evidence of God's intervention and miraculous care for him and for his armies in that particular moment. Constantine entered as a hero the city of Rome. He was welcomed by these people. They had asked for him to come. He had come and indeed had been successful. He does not do what every other Roman military commander had done up until that time in history when returning to Rome after a victory, and that was to go to the temple of Jupiter to offer sacrifices. He's the first guy in history who in fact refused to do that. It was almost taken for granted that he would, because it was much just tradition, and yet he said he would not do that. Instead, he got up and gave a speech to the people there who were in Rome, and at least this one quote is taken from that speech, in which he says, quote, "By this saving sign," and it was the Cairo symbol that he held up at that point, "the true token of bravery, I've delivered your city from the yoke of the tyrant." He, of course, said more. It was a longer speech than that, but that was the flavor of it. He gives credit fully and completely to God. He claims that it was the God of the Christian movement that had intervened at this point, and that this victory was in fact the direct result of God's work on his behalf. And of course the people living there in Italy accepted that and in fact embraced that as the explanation without any particular protest whatsoever. As a result of that, Constantine took control of the entire Western Empire. So now this is essentially what Constantine controls as of the year 312. All of North Africa, Spain, England, of course, Gaul, and Italy now as well. So the dividing line between East and West is really the line that separates the control of Constantine from the rest of the Roman world. In 313, Constantine issues what's called the Edict of Milan. So just 1 year later, this particular decree, which is sometimes called the Edict of Toleration, establishes a new public policy in all of Rome of full religious tolerance. He doesn't make the Christian religion the official religion, But he does establish a principle that no religion is going to be persecuted just by virtue of, being a particular religious expression, with certain limits. If your religion called for child sacrifice or something like that, that was a limit, But aside from that, we would call it a kind of experiment in religious toleration very early in Western history. It didn't quite look like religious toleration in America in the 21st century, but it was certainly a dramatic step in that direction. And so this is the first thing that Constantine does, and it doesn't make Christianity official, but it sort of puts it on an equal playing field, as it were, with the other pagan religions of the day. Second thing he did was restore all the property that had been confiscated by Diocletian to the Christian people from whom it had been taken. There had been huge amounts of property confiscated by Diocletian. All of it is returned. There was a meticulous accounting that Constantine undertook to make sure that everything was reinstated, at least to the degree it possibly could be. Over the next 10 years, he put in place multiple laws which, how can I put this? For the lawyers in the room, this would represent violation of the Establishment Clause on steroids, He passed all kinds of laws which were highly favorable to the Christian faith. So if for example, and there were many like this, if a person was a slave and they became a Christian, they were immediately emancipated. Things like that. Now, we look at this from 1700 years later and think, oh, come on, man, don't you can't buy people's faith. I mean, we understand that. I get that. But I think we need to appreciate that this was a very early time in Christian history, and a lot of experiments that we have tried and found wanting hadn't been tried yet. And Constantine, I really do think, while some people are very cynical about this, I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. He was prepared to set up any inducement he could think of to get people into the Christian church, including buying them, Well, that doesn't work so well. We understand that. You can't torture people into faith. You can't buy them into faith. You can't bribe them into faith. You can't even argue them into faith, ultimately. Faith is something God gives as a gift. We understand that. Constantine, I'm not sure quite got it. But he was really trying, I think, to get people to encourage them in the direction of Christian understanding. And so for the next 10 years or so, you do have a pretty significant, not surprisingly, growth of the Christian church. I mean, a lot of people became Christians, And I have no doubts that at least some of those people, while they may have entered the church with very mixed motives, might have over time actually become true and genuine Christian believers. Certainly not all, but enough that we should at least, give credit there where it's due. All right, so anyway, toward the end of this period, at about the year 324, war broke out between Constantine and his brother-in-law, Licinius, who was ruling in the east. There had been saber rattling for years. And again, I'm not going to try to sugarcoat it. I think Constantine may have been spoiling for a fight. I think certainly that's possible, and you can look at some of the things that happened. Licinius certainly was himself. And so the fact that there would inevitably be a conflict between these two, I think, was pretty much in the cards all the way through. It's just what the particular circumstances would be remained somewhat controversial or unexpected. But anyway, in 324, we have this war that breaks out between Licinius and Constantine. Constantine easily wins. And so at that point, he becomes the ruler of the entire Roman world. And so from 324 on, Constantine has united the entire Roman Empire. And of course, he never does impose Christianity as the official religion. That is to say, you've got to be a Christian or else. But he certainly does everything he can to favor it as time goes by. Probably the single biggest black mark on the career and history and reputation of Constantine is that after this war was over, he not only had Licinius executed, even though he earlier promised his sister, or not his sister, his wife. Licinius was his brother-in-law, so it was his wife's brother, and he had him executed, even though he'd promised to his wife he would not do that. He also had the son of Licinius executed. And people who don't like Constantine will invariably lock in on that, and I'm not trying to defend it. You know, sometimes political decisions are made which in retrospect we think were very unfortunate. I think that's probably the case here. But in any event, that would probably be, of all the things that happened in Constantine's career, the thing that's most controversial, and people who are critical will seize on that probably most quickly. The very following year, after this uniting of the Roman world, the biggest problem Constantine deals with is the squabble going on among Christians over the Arian controversy, and so he convenes the Nicene Council in 325. I'm going to save discussion of that for next week. This is a mosaic of Constantine that you find in the Hagia Sophia, that great Christian cathedral there in what was Constantinople, originally now Istanbul. And I want to just remind you of this text that we read in Revelation and return to it now briefly as our Sunday school lesson of the morning. So once again back here. This text, of course, is often associated with heaven. It cannot be heaven. All the discussion here is about earth. And so this is as a description, and I think good commentators have recognized this for a long time, that this is a description of God's people at work on earth. And everything that's stated here is really properly descriptive of God's work in history through his church. So, for example, John starts by saying, I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. Conspicuously absent from the Christian religion is a temple. We don't have a central sanctuary. We don't have pilgrimage. We don't have that kind of holy trek. Indeed, it's just the opposite. For us Christians, we are the temple on a holy trek to the world. The pilgrimage is taken just an opposite direction. We are told repeatedly in the New Testament, we are the temple of God. And so we are now a living edifice, you see. Peter says in his letter, we are living stones, you see. We are living rocks. And you take all of us together and it makes a building of living bricks. And the Holy Spirit resides in us, and where two or three of us are gathered, there is a place of worship. There is the presence of Christ. And so there's no temple in this city in the sense that there had been a temple and a temple-centric worship in the Old Covenant regime. The city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God is its light, and the lamp is the Lamb. How many times are we told in the New Testament, Christ is the light of the world, and then we're also told, we are the light of the world. We are the salt of the earth. We are those who carry the light of Christ with us. And so wherever we go and wherever the Christian movement has gone, cultures light up. People treat each other more civilly under the influence of the Christian message. That is demonstrably the case through history. I know people fixate on wars in the name of Christ, and I realize the Crusades are out there and so on, but in the greater scheme of things, this is one of the most uncontestable hypotheses we could possibly consider, that where the Christian message has been faithfully preached, people settle down. It is a civilizing influence. And that is because Christ is the light of the world, and my friends sitting here in Sunday school, you are the light of the world. You are the light in the office where you work. You are the light in the places where God sends you. You walk into a room, you light it up by the glory of God residing in you because you are his temple, and the light shining out the windows. He continues, the nations will walk by its light, and notice the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. I love this image. Constantine, he brought immense glory into the city of God, brought immense glory into the place of worship, and he was only the first. And as we look through history, we find that repeatedly, again and again, the kings of the earth, you see, this is referring to human history. What about Charlemagne? What about Otto I? What about Christian rulers in Europe and England and so on, down through history, and increasingly in other parts we find rulers of the earth bringing into the community of faith the best of their treasures, you see. Again, we see that kind of thing happening all through history. Its gates will never be shut by day. There will be no night there. They used to say of the British Empire, the sun never sets, right, on the British Empire. I tell you, the sun never sets on the kingdom of Christ in this world. You go anywhere in the world and you will find the Christian movement, sometimes persecuted, sometimes beleaguered, sometimes underground, but there is no place you can go in the great quadrants of this planet where you don't find, God's people there faithfully carrying on their worship. People, listen to this, will bring into it the glory and the honor of the nations. How much of the great music in history has been in celebration of the Christian message? How much of the great art in history has been in celebration of the Christian message? How much of great architecture in history has been in celebration of the Christian message? How much of great literature has had to be conversant with and participate in the conversation about the Christian message? How much has the Christian message conditioned the very best, the very glorious expressions of the very best of what we are as human beings? How much of it? Everything from Handel's Messiah, right through 20th century and 21st century music is constantly coming back, the best of it, and celebrating the Christian message. And again, it's a remarkable realization of what seemed pretty unlikely when these words were written. Nothing unclean will enter it, nor anyone who practices abomination or falsehood, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. We are said to be as those people who enter into the Christian community, those who have been washed. We've been washed by the blood of the Lamb. We've been washed by the waters of baptism. We have come into this. We obviously have a mixed bag in the Christian world. We understand there's the visible church and the invisible church, and the visible church can have a mixed population. But in terms of the true people of God, the true church of God in history, the true city of God, it is populated by those who have been touched redemptively by Christ and have been washed free of the taint of sin. And in Christ we stand before God as those who are perfect and justified, sanctified, and it is all because, of course, of what Christ has done for us. So I just want to say all of this to you because that's us we're talking about. We are these people. And never underestimate the potency of the effect of the presence of Christ in you as you go into the various places to which God calls you.